Beijing pledging to help African nations in industry, infrastructure, trade and investment at China's biggest diplomatic event in years. For more, Jana de Kluiver, research officer at Institute of Security Studies, joins us live from South Africa's administrative capital of Pretoria. Thanks for joining us, Mr. Kluiver. Now, part of this help...
Thanks for having me.
This pledge from China to the African continent is the more than $51 billion in fresh funding. If we compare that to what has been announced in past years, so 2021, it was $40 billion, and that's partially because of the pandemic. But since before that, it was $60 billion. But if we look back to 2006, it was just $5 billion. So put this in context. At more than $50 billion, is this a great deal of money? Will it make a huge difference to the African continent?
I definitely think more important than the actual sum of money that was committed was how that money will ultimately be used in an African context. In terms of some of the outcomes that we've recently seen as outlined in President Xi Jinping's speech, there is quite some promising developments in terms of finance for green projects and sustainable energy products, which is something that's very crucial in an African context. Furthermore, support in terms of connectivity infrastructure to support the African Continental Free Trade Agreements is also a very promising development. However, the sum alone very much makes sense in terms of where the China-Africa relationship stands at the moment, but ultimately it will boil down to how it's being implemented. In terms of the fluctuation in commitments that we've seen, I 100% agree. The dip we saw in 2021 in a lot of ways I think could have been attributed to the COVID-19 pandemic. And the years prior, it's also important to keep in mind that these were summits and not mere ministerial level meetings. And generally, summits tend to also gain a bit of a larger financial commitment. It's usually determined by the need for China-Africa relations at that point in time. So I think a lot of it can also be attributed towards that.
All right. Let's stick on implementation. So if it's more than $50 billion, what we have seen, so we had a string of bilateral meetings yesterday and a string of announcements of what was likely to be taking place between China and individual African countries. Looking at those deals, looking at, I suppose, precedents set in the past in terms of meeting pledges made at summits like these, do you see promising details on how implementation might be in delivering this $50 billion?
The reality remains that transparency is oftentimes lacking in a lot of these agreements, although on a high level there will be announcements like we've seen today in terms of also the Beijing Action Plan and understanding how this will possibly be implemented. It still involves a lot of diplomatic language and not necessarily breaks down to implementation level. Also, given that a lot of these agreements are on a bilateral basis, it makes it very difficult to truly understand what the full T's and C's at the end of the day will be. So this is one of the areas where I think it would be difficult to fully track it. There has been some research that has indicated that, especially in terms of loan agreement, there is a follow-through, but there is still no full-blown mechanism to truly track this.
All right, you stressed earlier the need to implement in the African context. Now, the obvious needs that context would be, for example, creation of jobs, making sure Africa moves up the value chain. In terms of past promises made, earlier our correspondent in Beijing mentioned that pledge to buy $300 billion in African goods. That was made at the last summit. That has not been met on the Chinese side. Agreements in the past, have they met? Can they really be met?
It's very difficult in order to truly understand how many of these commitments came to fruition. But I would say in terms of some of the commitments we've seen this year in trade, that was definitely something that the African continent was looking out for, towards working towards a more equitable trade relations. And I do think there has been some development in this regard. For example, the decision to offer zero tariff treatment on 100% of tariff lines for least developed countries. This can be very promising. Furthermore, e-commerce platforms, in order to also grant access to the Chinese market, are some of the more positive contributions that we've seen to a degree in 2021, continue through to 2024. So I do think there is some positive developments in terms of trade relations, but in terms of actually tracking these commitments, that is still rather tedious. I would suggest that if the increased transparency on this front could also be in place, that would make it much easier to also understand how the China-Africa relationship is evolving, and also ultimately how civil society can hold their own governments to account in terms of how these deals are conducted and how they're being implemented. In terms of job creation, President Xi Jinping did pledge 1 million jobs for Africans to be created. This is very promising in the sense that it does engage on a local context more than we had seen previously, which is a positive shift, and also reflects some of the previous critiques that have been made towards Chinese investment that does not necessarily trickle down to truly impact on a local level. So these are a few promising developments, I would say, in that regard.
Are you also seeing promise in another area, which is small but beautiful projects? So this is a promise from the Chinese side, the BRI shifting focus towards cheap and green projects as opposed to huge infrastructure projects that are then very difficult for individual African states to finance and leaving them, in many cases, in debt that they cannot manage. Are we seeing significant, tangible shift to projects like these?
I would agree that we are, and this is coming in a lot of ways through some of the developments we've seen in the Belt and Road Forum last year, as well as in the 2021 FOCAC. It's oftentimes termed as small is beautiful, which refers to smaller and greener projects that ultimately also has a bigger spillover effect in terms of local benefit. So this type of trend is something that's much more sustainable to African economies that are struggling to repay debt. And it also has a quicker turnaround in terms of profitability for the Chinese implementing partner. So in a lot of ways, although larger infrastructure projects are also required in the long term, and it's an important aspect to have in place, at least within the current context, it is a safer option to go for the small is beautiful approach. So in my opinion, I would say that this has more of a sustainable effect, especially if it's implemented in critical sectors such as green development as well as renewable energy.
Thanks for breaking down those pledges made at this summit. Ms. Jana de Kluiver, Research Officer at the Institute of Security Studies in Pretoria, speaking to us. I thank you.